Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall. For those of you who are new here, since we just set up streaming to Substack as well, the Protocol Town Hall is a weekly guest talk series where we invite people from the field of protocol studies and people in the field working on protocols to come talk about theory, application, new ideas, what they're working on, lessons for how to apply protocols, and generally what's going on in the field of protocols. And today, our guest is Cory Levinson, who is an engineer, analyst, artist, and climate tech consultant who has been keeping an eye on protocols for a while now. He gave a guest talk to the Summer of Protocols cohort in 2023 and has since been updating his theses, doing some more stuff, and now he's back in 2025 with the latest and greatest and some new ideas about what's going on in climate tech and protocols, and we're very happy to have him here. Protocols for planetary health have become an important topic worldwide as we face more and more issues with climate, more and more unexpected problems. And so it's good to have Cory here to give us a sense of the field of play today. So with that said, welcome to the Protocol Town Hall, Cory.
Thanks. Mic check. Can you guys hear me okay?
Sounds great.
Cool. All right, so let's get into that. I'll be quick on this slide. Thanks for the great introduction, Timber. I started my career working at SoundCloud as a software and product person working with their data infrastructure team in 2011 or so. And for the last 5 years, I've been pretty focused on climate tech. I spent a lot of time with this organization, Regen Network, where I was working most recently, and am now spending a lot of my time researching data infrastructure systems in the carbon removal industry, specifically looking at different technical frameworks that can support protocols and interoperability in open system CDR pathways. And we'll get into what all of that is throughout the talk. I'm also about to be starting a grad program at UC Davis in the fall with their soil and biogeochemistry group. So that'll be another kind of venue for me to be continuing both this research and a lot more specific looking into the science side of things. So here's an overview of the stuff we're going to be looking at. We'll kind of start with putting carbon into context. This is called climate protocols, but really a lot of the focus of my research has been on carbon removal, carbon markets, and so that'll be what most of the talk is about. And we'll start with some context setting. We'll then look at where the voluntary carbon market is at today. We'll look at some of the regulatory frameworks and climate policy that intersects with the existing carbon financing infrastructure. And then we'll look at the way that people are talking about different kinds of pathways for carbon dioxide removal. There's a term, open versus closed systems, that I think has been really useful for my own understanding of the space. And hopefully that's something that folks can take away from here as well. We'll then look specifically at some data protocols in carbon markets, close off with some prior art in scientific data standards, and some concluding thoughts. So to start with, putting carbon into context, it's all about targets. And I think that, it's nice to sort of frame things back to the Paris Agreement, 2015, what it means for us to be thinking about carbon and accounting for carbon and standardizing the way that we look at greenhouse gases more generally. So it was 2015 when there was global consensus from the UN parties to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, aiming for 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial temperatures. In that framework of the Paris Agreements, each country sets its own nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which they update every 5 years. And these are intended to become progressively more ambitious over time. Current trajectories suggest that we're still on a path well exceeding those 2.5 degrees of warming. And these NDCs are central to global climate governance, but they really lack enforceability. The Paris Agreement and the UN in general is not an enforcement body. So while these are, contributions commitments being made at a national and jurisdictional level, there is no enforcement of those. And so it even on the regulatory side can be sort of seen as a voluntary agreement. Then on the corporate side, you have this, one of these initiatives that I think is worth highlighting, which is lesser known to folks, is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. This is a corporate climate action organization that enables companies to do similar to what governments have done with nationally determined contributions, where they can say, here's what our goals are as a corporate, as a company. Here's our targets when it comes to what our emissions reduction goals are over the next several decades, and any other climate impacts that we're trying to make. And the goal of SBTI is to have some framework for ensuring and allowing for corporates to align their own corporate goals with these international goals of the Paris Agreement. So, this is when people look at companies, whether they be airline companies or big tech companies, saying that they have net zero goals or goals to be carbon negative by a certain date. A lot of times that is tracked and sort of registered through this SBTI framework. And over 10,000 companies to date have committed or set targets based on that. So one of the things that's happened recently, if you look then specifically at carbon in the last, I'd say maybe 5 years, but it really came into focus in the last 3 years or so, is this idea of durable CDR. Previously, well, let's go back to 2018, because that's when it actually came out from the IPCC, the group that put forward that informs a lot of the UN work that's happening around the Paris Agreement and serves as the kind of scientific credibility for a lot of that work. They came out and basically said that in all scenarios of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, they all require some form of carbon removal to offset residual emissions. And this is what you're seeing on the right, is that even in our best case scenarios, where we do all of the emissions cleanup that we are going to be doing, carbon removal can't be just thought of purely as a greenwashing technology or as a greenwashing component of our climate goals. Because even in our best case scenarios, from a scientific perspective, we're going to maybe, let's say, get rid of 90% of our current emissions, but there will have to be some ability to take carbon out of the atmosphere, put it into long-term durable storage into the ground. And that's going to have to operate on a gigaton scale, even just to cover for the small amount of residual emissions that we anticipate having in the decades forward. And that's not even speaking to, another thing that people argue as a case for carbon removal is historical cleanup. So if we find ourselves in an overshoot scenario, which is quite likely, where our warming budgets are being exceeded, carbon removals is one of the few things that we have at our disposal to try and actually clean up for, pre-existing years of unwanted emissions. So recent things that have sort of accelerated this idea of durable carbon removal, where we're not just talking about, avoidance credits, where we're saying that, we're preventing a forest from getting cut down, to shifting strategy to rather saying, what are the different mechanisms that we have at our disposal to operate on a geological timescale, on centuries to millennia, for removing and storing carbon from the atmosphere. I want to also point to, in 2025, it was just this year when the SBTI, that group that I mentioned earlier, updated their corporate net zero standards to actually start to include a mechanism for removals into near-term targets for the voluntary carbon markets. And so today we're at around less than 1 megaton a year delivered globally. The estimates from scientific groups are that we're going to need around 5 to over a dozen gigatons per year by the 2050 timeline. So looking at where things are today, this idea of durable CDR, one of the organizations that really sort of kicked this off into the public consciousness within the removal space was Frontier, which was an advanced market commitment founded by Stripe, Shopify, Meta, Alphabet, and a few others, committing over $1 billion to purchasing durable carbon removal credits. And the thought is that this isn't them saying, okay, here's our entire budget for removals over the next several decades. It's them pooling together an amount of capital to say, we need to see this industry start to mature, and we need to start to invest in it today if it has any chance of scaling to the desired size that the market needs to be, or that the capacity for removals needs to be at in the decades to come. And so with that new focus of durable CDR, we also have a new set of parties who are trying to standardize and sort of register these projects and host the methodologies and the scientific protocols for how you quantify these different kinds of carbon removal methods. So in the previous world of the older voluntary carbon markets, which had a lot of forest carbon, you had Vera, you had players like Gold Standard, you had the American Carbon Registry. If those names are familiar to you, these are two examples of some of the more modern and durable CDR-focused registries, Isometric on the left and Puro on the right. And with Isometric, they've got this page on their registry, which you can go to, it's all public, where they're starting to do a breakdown of what this world looks like, right? There isn't just one clear idea or one specific technology that folks are wanting to leverage or focus on for CDR. And in general, within the industry, there's an understanding that we need to be trying for all pathways right now and seeing which ones have the most potential. And investing in a lot of different pathways is going to be a necessary part of getting us to finding the ones that have the most promise from a policy perspective, from a technological perspective, and also like community impact. So the 6 that you're seeing here, we don't need to go into them in too much detail, but the ones that I want to highlight are enhanced weathering. This top one in the middle, that's one where there's a crushing of rock dust that is being spread over agricultural fields. And when rainfall happens over the ag fields, there's a mineralization process where that CO2 from the atmosphere turns into bicarbonates, which go into the water stream, and they're durably stored later in water systems and in the ocean. Direct air capture on the bottom left is one that's maybe more familiar to folks, where you have these giant air sucking machines that are solar powered, hopefully, and or some kind of renewable power, and are sucking air out and are then doing some kind of chemical reactions within their plants and geological storage. And so, in terms of where this is at today, as I mentioned, things were starting to happen, maybe 5 years ago or so, but it's really in the last couple of years that this market has really started to pick up. You've seen durable CDR purchases scale quite significantly in 2023 and 2024. But one of the standout messages from this is when you look behind the scenes of who's actually making these purchases, it's really a small group of corporates who are leading the charge in investing in these kinds of technologies. That number 2 line here is the frontier group that I mentioned in a few slides previous. But even them, this giant corporate coalition advanced market commitment of $1 billion doesn't really hold much compared to Microsoft, who has done some pretty significant investment in the industry. Now, the nice thing is that if you were to take Microsoft out of this previous chart, you would still see a pretty positive looking trajectory, but yeah, sprinkled throughout it all, it's quite clear that there's few actors who are playing a quite outsized impact. So if that's what's going on in the private markets, I think we then have to look to see how are the regulators responding to this, because there's no world in which all of the needs for removals are purely just going to be paid by corporates. People understand that these need to get baked into policy frameworks and potentially direct procurement where countries are actually directly financing and paying for some of these removal practices. So let's dig a little bit into what that looks like. On the UN and EU side, the first thing worth mentioning is what was formerly called Article 6.4 in the Paris Agreement has now been rebranded as the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism. This is the sort of regulatory vehicle through which any kind of alignment with the voluntary carbon market and the compliance markets to support the Paris Agreement are expected to happen, where there's going to be a clear set of roles. There's a supervisory body that's been established called the PACM Supervisory Body that basically dictates, are there specific registries, whether they be isometric or Puro, and specific methodologies that those registries have published on their systems that an international body agrees on is a legitimate type of credit, and therefore is whitelisted or brought into this category of credits that can be used for international trading of offsets. There's a lot of challenges with that, because the second you get into international trading of offsets, there's not just the questions around double counting and corporates claiming the same benefits that a country is claiming, which this would hope to mitigate, but also questions of who actually should be paying for activities in what jurisdictions. Is it right and is it just for global north and EU countries to be directly paying for and financing and essentially buying and exhausting all of the carbon removal supply or potential from a global south country? Or is it better and more appropriate that those global south countries have the ability to develop those removal capacities in-house and account for them towards their own emissions? Markets open up a lot of ways that could get, the challenges could arise through that. Then within the EU, you have this emissions trading system. This is a EU level cap and trade system, primarily aimed at emissions reduction. But recently, there's been the introduction of the carbon removal certification framework, where the EU has been starting to develop their own system for what are the kinds of carbon removal methodologies and protocols that they want to allow to potentially count against their emissions trading system framework. Now, if you look to the US, things are a little bit of a different story. Whereas on the EU side, you've got a lot of these explicit mechanisms, whether they be cap and trade or otherwise, to try and allow and enable for trading of credits between different jurisdictional bodies. In the US, they've taken kind of a different approach. They're basically doing tax credits and direct grant programs to fund research. We're not in a state in the US policy landscape where there's a lot of desire or activity around states trading carbon credit balances. There isn't, because the US just lacks a lot in terms of its own targets for climate mitigation. There really isn't that infrastructure or need yet. But what they do have is they've created a tax credit, which is specifically for direct air capture projects, which they've just put a price. It's, I think, $180 a ton for DAC projects under certain, registered methodologies where they can verify it, will then be able to have support in the financing of their projects. And then outside of that, tax credit initiatives, there's a few different grant funding initiatives that have happened over the previous years. The Department of Energy has put about $3.5 billion in funding for regional direct air capture hubs. There was an ARPA-E award, which is also from the Department of Energy, of around $36 million for a number of different research projects looking at marine carbon dioxide removal. And prior to the current administration coming into office, the USDA had this Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities initiative, which had a whole number of different projects that different nonprofits or private companies could be getting grants to be supporting farmers transitioning to better climate practices. And some of those were working with specific carbon removal pathways, like the enhanced rock weathering one that I mentioned earlier. So comparing these a little bit, apples to oranges, on the EU side, you've got these mandated markets, you've got a cap and trade systems being explored, certification frameworks, and in general, a bias towards direct air capture and BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, within their research reports that they're putting out. And on the US side, you've also got tax credit schemes that heavily favor DAC. You've got some direct research funding happening, and you've got a lot of funding for DAC infrastructure and a little bit starting to happen for these other novel pathways like ocean and enhanced weathering. So one of the things that we're seeing with this, looking at the regulatory, and also this comes up in the voluntary context, is that not all carbon removal is treated equally, both by governments and markets. So to get into that, let's look a bit at a few of the different ways that people are trying to create taxonomies or categorizations for these different pathways. And one of the ones that I've been finding the most useful is this distinction of open versus closed system pathways. So if you're curious about digging into this in more detail, there's a few different resources, all quite lengthy, but I think, throwing any of these into a Notebook LM or ChatGPT, you'd be able to, spin up a podcast and really get a lot out of it. The CDR Primer is a book that's a beautiful printed edition and has a fully available online edition that was published in 2021. There's Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, published their Applied Innovation Roadmap for CDR in 2023. That's a 400-page guide assessing 32 different CDR approaches. And just earlier this year, the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change published Scaling Up Carbon Dioxide Removals, a 333-page report offering recommendations for the EU to both enhance CDR deployments and connect it into some of the existing European regulatory frameworks that I was talking about. So what we're looking at on the left here is a screenshot from that CDR primer book. What we're looking at on the right is from RMI's Applied Innovation Roadmap. And there's a lot of pictures, there's a lot of icons, and there's different ways that different folks are talking about this. On the left, this is sort of earlier. The CDR primer was published back in 2021. You can see they're talking about coastal blue carbon, accelerated chemical weathering of rocks, direct air capture, waste biomass processing, increased soil carbon sequestration, the forest carbon initiatives. All of these is, having different kind of components. And then on the underside below that sort of that line, you can see the different sort of storage mechanisms that are in play, and what's happening, whether it's, we're talking about storing carbon in the soil versus the ocean, geologic formation, et cetera. A few years later, what you see is the RMI group trying to be much, much more clear and much, much more higher level, splitting pathways into 3 top level categories. And if you go into detail, they're going to have all of the same, specific pathways that the CDR primer is looking at. But in terms of categorization, they're using this language of biogenic, which is any carbon removal technology that's leveraging existing biological processes. So naturally occurring biogenic carbon fixation mechanisms, similar to photosynthesis. That's the most prevalent one, right? So if you're dealing with biochar, which is where you take existing biomass and you're pyrolyzing it so it turns into a charcoal, that charcoal is considered a durable store of carbon and can be used to apply as a supplement in agricultural fields, can be spread within forests to just increase the health of the soil. There's a lot of just general benefits to biochar application in both agriculture and forest projects. And when since it's starting with biomass that at some point earlier on had photosynthesis happening, it's considered a biogenic approach to CDR. Geochemical CDR is going to be any mechanism that's leveraging geochemical pathways, thinking about enhanced rock weathering, where you're looking at a mineralization that happens in an open environment. Similarly, in ocean alkalinity enhancement, there's dosing of alkaline elements, typically minerals, to the surface level of the ocean that then react with the CO2 that's in the upper levels of the ocean. And that geochemical process that happens, those both would fall into this second category. And the third one being synthetic CDR, you're looking at more traditional direct air capture plant type mechanisms. So lots of different pathways. And when we look at some of the ways that these are treated in the voluntary carbon markets, this is a great slide from CDR.FYI's 2024 year in review. There's a lot of varying prices for these. Biochar definitely seems to be the most affordable, and today it's where most of the deliveries are happening, meaning when people are purchasing any of these other credits, they're usually purchasing a contract that then says, these credits will be delivered, the carbon will be removed over X number of years. Whereas biochar, that's a pathway that, deliveries are typically happening pretty quickly, and the technology is there. People know what it takes to pyrolyze woody debris, and the price point is a bit lower. When you look at marine carbon dioxide removal, that's one where it's still so novel, and there's a lot of research being done on it and a lot of monitoring that has to happen, so the price points can really vary quite a lot. And direct air capture is generally understood to be one of the most expensive mechanisms. There's a lot of hope from folks in the industry that is a pathway that, through investments similar to battery technology, can scale over time. I'm personally not as optimistic about DAX, but it is nonetheless where a lot of the money is going today. And so to look specifically at the investment, here's then the chart, 2022 to 2024, direct air capture is still a huge proportion of most of the investment happening in durable CDR. And that sliver at the top, those top two, is the marine carbon dioxide removal and enhanced weathering mechanisms. So getting to this idea of open and closed systems. This is an article, a great article that I would recommend folks take a look at, published by Di Ellis and John Sanchez in 2023. This was right around the time that they were founding and kicking off this organization that they've started called Cascade Climate. And this article was called Leveling the Playing Field for Open Systems Carbon Removal. So they were, I don't think that they were the first people necessarily to give it that name, but what they're really doing is making the case here for the much needed deeper investment in the science of open systems and a detailed articulation of why the science is hard and why it's currently lagging behind due to a lot of the lack of investment. So closed systems is where we're going to see things that are industrial, controlled processes like direct air capture, where you have access to, as an engineer or as a project developer, every molecule of CO2 that's being sequestered. Closed systems include DAC, but another example of a closed system pathway would be biochar, where if you want to measure the amount of carbon that's being stored, you just weigh the biochar and you know how much CO2 is being sequestered there. In open system pathways, these are the ones where we're relying on existing natural processes and trying to think of ways to accelerate and scale up these natural processes that are already removing carbon from the atmosphere. So you think of the ocean. The ocean is a huge carbon sink, has been for its entire existence. And marine CDR, obviously there are some marine CDR pathways which you could consider closed systems, like kelp sinking, growing biomass and sinking it to the ocean floor, but ones where you're relying on biogeochemical processes or geochemical processes to happen in an open, uncontrolled environment, the monitoring of those systems are much more complex, and you can't count all of the carbon molecules that you're actually trying to account for. So the high level is closed are simpler for their MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, and they're costlier per ton. Open systems are cheaper per ton generally, if you were to think about them as, if we were to have a clearer idea of the monitoring side, right? But they're much harder to quantify. And because of that difficulty in quantifying, there's oftentimes much more sampling that's required to date. And so the prices are, not as cheap as they could be. So let's go back to that graph that we had earlier showing the isometric protocols. Here's just a splitting of them to kind of indicate, okay, of the ones that a registry is publishing, how are they thinking about this? They've got a decent balance, you can see. So some of these are going to be closed system pathways. Some of them are going to be open system pathways. And I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive now into what that open system quantification can look like. This is a slide from Loeb Planavsky, who's a professor at Yale. He's one of the leading researchers in enhanced rock weathering in the industry. And what this is showing is for an MRV process, for monitoring, reporting, and verification, to be really accounting properly for all of the carbon removal in one of these mechanisms. It's not just the in-field sampling that you need in this, green square up top. And it's not just the models that you need to develop for how, in theory, the carbon is to be sequestered and how you relate that sampling to the modeling system. But there's also these downstream effects of where the weathering products are ending up. Where are these mineralized bicarbonates traveling to? How are they moving through both the water systems, the catchment river networks, and eventually how are they moving into ocean storage? And so that necessity to be moving outside of the domain of what's just the project boundary is one of the things that makes, I think, this field especially challenging to monitor. And so Another way of thinking about this is that in the open system pathways, we don't have as much of a quantification problem as an attribution problem. Sure, with each project, we can deploy a little monitoring system, but the real issue is that what we want and need these more regional approaches to our monitoring and verification processes. We need to be looking more broadly than the specific site that we're doing our experiments in. And in the ocean context, you could be working in a bay, you could be working in Vancouver where there's a bunch of projects, or Halifax, Nova Scotia. Canada's been doing a lot of work in marine carbon dioxide removal and ocean alkalinity enhancement specifically. And in both of those areas, the monitoring, yes, should be happening locally, but there's also a need to be looking at much more wide geographic areas. So one of the key hypotheses shared by organizations like Cascade and Carbon to Sea, which is a big nonprofit funding a lot of ocean carbon removal work, is that stronger systems for data sharing will be essential for not only the regional global MRV required in open systems, but also for improving the science of all of this open systems carbon removal. So getting into some of the stuff that I've been spending a lot of time looking at recently, let's look at some data protocols that have been popping up in the space. So there's a number of different ways that people use the language of protocols in the carbon removal industry. And the three categories that have been useful for me for this are financial, scientific, and data. In financial protocols, you have things like project financing, transaction logic, software infrastructure to support transactions, marketplace infrastructure, but also you have things like just the fact that today, how are people executing transactions? How are people making deals? They're doing it on LinkedIn. They're making blog posts. They're announcing all of their big deals. They're connecting with each other through professional networks. And it's a very over-the-counter market financially. Now, scientific protocols, these are going to be where the detailed rules are documented for how, for a given pathway, you need to account for the carbon removal. How do you account for the LCA or just the emissions of your existing project, right? Certainly there might be some carbon emissions and you need to subtract that from any of the removals that you're happening in your work. And how are you actually doing the measurement and how are you doing the verification, whether it's through third-party auditors or something similar. And that's going to be very specific to any different pathway. And then data protocols, this is where you get to specific variable lists, controlled vocabularies, technical standards that require certain types of projects be publishing data sets in certain ways. And also I'm including in here purchase agreements. It's now starting to become practice that within a carbon removal purchase agreement, there are data stipulations about data sharing that the project developer needs to make certain kinds of data accessible to be improving the science. So here's a little visual layout of the landscape. You can see a number of the different actors that we've talked about already, and kind of where they fit between these three categories. So one of the ones that I want to talk about, which has been quite exciting to me, I've been fortunate to connect with this group and have been starting to support a little bit in the things that they're thinking through, is this Carbon Data Open Protocol. This was a project that was launched earlier this year, and it's taking inspiration from an initiative called the Financial Industry Business Ontology, which is a software system and essentially a kind of like a data protocol for financial protocols, where you can standardize the APIs that different actors are using in this whole process. So this is an initiative that's quite exciting to me. The approach that they're taking, I think, is pretty spot on. They're getting together a bunch of the different actors, they're pulling them into a room, and they're saying, okay, how is everyone storing their data? How is everyone serving up their APIs? And what are the ways that we can sort of align on a minimum standard or a bar that folks need to adhere to, and how can we tag every organization's different APIs with a sort of unified system that makes it easier for interoperability across both the market and also the like rating and verification systems. But now looking towards the more scientific data side, I want to come back to the point that the folks at Cascade were making, which is why invest in data standards in open systems carbon removal. So this was a flywheel diagram that I found kind of useful. What we have today is we have a pretty rapid proliferation of commercial field trials. The thought is that data sharing can enable bioregional MRV and unlocking new science, and stronger data standards should be able to ensure streamlined access to these data sets from disparate parties, and really making that connection between the top of this chart and the right of this chart faster, more accelerated, and just like, easier for the industry to unlock this this flywheel here. And downstream, this is then reducing quantification uncertainty, improving confidence and investment in the field, and just helping us mature our understanding of how these different pathways function. So Cascade, this is the organization started by the folks who wrote that blog post that I had mentioned earlier. They've got an initiative and a project called the ERW Data Query, and that's a system for storing data from enhanced rock weathering pilots. This was initially focused really on the legal agreements. So as part of this initiative, they started with a round of trying to get Frontier and other buyer groups to put data sharing stipulations into their enhanced rock weathering purchase agreements, and now have created a closed repository that where basically researchers can apply for access to certain kinds of data, whether they be open or proprietary. So some of the data is going to be public. Some of the data, especially when you're dealing with ERW, you're dealing with farmer data. So some of that is quite sensitive. Farmers want to have control or consent over usages of their data. So there's a mechanism by which researchers need to actually go through a kind of application process to say, hey, I'm doing this synthesis analysis, and I'd like to have access to these different kinds of data sets. So while they focused on getting this system in place, what they haven't focused on as much to date is the actual detailed data standard side of things. They've got a pretty comprehensive variable list of the different types of variables that one would want to see when submitting these data sets. And I think they've been able to work with some spreadsheet templates to try and support project developers to standardize against that. But there's the focus of their initiative to date has really been around the agreements, the repository hosting, and the access mechanism for researchers to be able to get data. Now, on the other side, you've got another quite similar project led by this nonprofit Carbon to Sea called the Ocean Alkalinity Enhancement Data Protocol. And what's interesting, and these groups both know each other, they've been in conversation for a while. I've been speaking with both of these groups and supporting in some small ways as well. This project has taken the opposite approach, where what they're starting with actually is a very detailed field variable list. They've got a 58-page document, which is a draft protocol of exactly what kinds of variables need to be reported for any ocean alkalinity field trial, and how those should be documented. What this project has yet to do is really think through the where the data is going to live and how access control will happen for that. That's a bit of an open question. But the landscape is a little bit different in the ocean world. Whereas in the agriculture space, you've got private data at the end of the day. A lot of it, it's maybe startups, or it could be academics who are doing these field trials, but you've always got a landowner who, owns the farm, has the agricultural land, and has some say in the data usage. In the ocean context, there's a much longer history of us treating the ocean like a public good. And with that, a lot of the field trials, whether they be private or whether they be scientific research field trials, already have a baked in understanding and expectation that most ocean data can and should be open. Now, of course, there's some exception to this, and there are some types of data that the private startups that are doing OAE field trials are wanting to keep within their world for IP reasons and stuff. But by and large, ocean is a much more open domain when it comes to how folks are thinking about their data. And so when I've been looking at this, one of the things that's really attracted me to all of this work is thinking through how software and data systems can better support these types of initiatives. And with that, I've spent a lot of time looking at other scientific data standards groups, completely outside of the domain of carbon removal, just to see where else we might be able to take some inspiration from. So there's two projects. I'll talk a little bit about them both here, and then I'll dig deeper into this one on the right. That are both kind of coming more from the academic and actually the government research community. So on the left, you have the National Microbiome Data Collaborative. That's a project that I believe spun out or is being hosted and maintained by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So this is a government national lab that has set up a portal and basically a data platform for community submission and storage of microbiome data. And back behind the scenes of this, they have a standardized unified data model using a tool called LinkML that is a very impressive software tool that allows you to define single schemas in YAML configuration files that then can compile to a number of different software formats like JSON-LD or RDF or I don't know if they have XML support, but they do. You can compile spreadsheet templates, for example. So it's a tool chain that basically allows you to auto-generate a bunch of different data formats from a single standardized and unified data model. And then on the right, we've got this this project called Data One, which sits a little bit differently. This is more of an interoperability between data repositories initiative, where what you had happening in the environmental data repository community is a bunch of different organizations, a bunch of different universities or national agencies hosting data repositories wanting to have a unified kind of search experience or discoverability. And Data One was an initiative that started to look at that. So in essence, it's a meta repository for searching for data sets across a wide variety of environmental data repositories. And this Ocean Info Hub project is essentially the same thing, but specific to ocean data repositories. So in both of these examples, they've built these search capabilities in these interfaces upon this project called schema.org, which was an initiative that actually was started by Google and a bunch of different search engines coming together saying, we'd like to standardize the way that HTML pages serve machine readable metadata. We want, if you're looking at movie listings, that a movie listing website is not just needing to be crawled and have their HTML parsed by Google, but that there's something at the top before you get into the main, HTML browser ready content. You get some HTML head information that is a JSON document that maybe describes in a unified language, that you're talking about movie listings, what the show times are, or if you're a small business, that you're a restaurant, what your menu is. This has been around for a long time. I can't remember when schema.org was started, but you can see in this text here, it says, as of 2024, over 45 million web domains mark up their web pages with over 450 billion schema.org objects. And so the science community, the folks doing academic research and looking at scientific data repositories, see this and are like, well, this should be available for scientific data. And so with that was birthed this working group called scienceonschema.org, which was an initiative to basically make a specific set of recommendations for the scientific data repository community to make their data sets allowable and accessible in a standardized way from search engines. And the nice thing about this is it doesn't just work well for these projects like Data One and Ocean Info Hub. it also works well for Google. So if you go to Google dataset search, this is the basis under which Google dataset search is also able to crawl and index academic and scientific data repositories. So some of the things that I think we can take from this, and where I'd like to see the carbon removal industry move, is kind of really towards embracing community-driven protocol development. So OBO Foundry is one of the kind of governing bodies or organizations responsible for a lot of interrelated work connected to that National Microbiome Data Collaborative Initiative at Berkeley Lab. Earth Science Information Partners is an organization that hosted the working group for the scienceonschema.org work. They're both, I think, doing a really great job of holding space for real people to gather and standardize terms and names for real world things related to scientific data. And carbon removal as an industry, I think it's not only going to take funding to scale it, but we also need really concrete mechanisms on this data protocol layer to make the technology development feasible. So many of the components of the CDR stack that could be protocolized, I feel like we're at a point where they're at risk of becoming captured by specific actors. If you see registries like Isometric, making claims about, oh, well, we're hosting the scientific protocols and da-da-da-da-da. And now, there's a risk there that singular organizations, kind of seek or take too much responsibility within this sector. And so I think these types of, governing and standard-based organizational structures really should be an important part of the path forward. So that, that was all my content. And thank you for having me. Happy to take some questions if we have some.
Nice. Thanks, Cory. That was super cool. Man, that's so complicated. All that stuff is going on. That's unbelievable how many different ways there are to tackle it and how many different problems there are. I didn't see any questions, but selfishly, I have some that I'm curious about. And my first one was kind of related to your last point about how these comments could be captured if all the scientific protocols live in one place. Do you see a future where carbon storage becomes part of the civic infrastructure, kind of like how we have water sewage systems today?
Yeah, I think that will play a role for sure. I think it starts with the grant kind of the grant making that the US has done a bit of, and the next step, which folks talk about, is what they call direct procurement. So what that means is a state or a governing body basically making purchases. In the direction of, if your question was more about will the actual technology development be something that's managed and done by the state, I guess the places where that is starting to happen is in the US funding these regional direct air capture hubs. So that's them trying to do a little bit of that, of what does it mean for the government to play a more active role, and to have that be a part of that is workforce development, going to regions and saying okay, we need to make a plan for this coal-based community. Let's not just have a bunch of think about the economic development opportunities for this area purely in terms of transitioning to renewables, but let's also think about removal capacity. So some of that is happening, but I think a lot of the research and the technology development will continue to happen in more of an open market-based environment, and the government engagement will for a while look hopefully just more direct procurement, where they're budgeting it and saying, okay, we're going to buy X amount, or we're going to have, I think there was already one carbon removal prize that the Department of Energy did, but more things akin to that.
Okay, so more of a market making role than actually directly funding specific kinds of technologies and building that into public infrastructure. I did miss a question in the chat actually, which was, so the last time you spoke was in 2023, I believe, in the summer. And since then, what have been the biggest things that have changed over the last 2 years?
I mean, I feel like I feel like in some ways this talk was kind of just a lot of that, because a lot of this stuff is new. A lot of the things that I was talking about today, maybe to connect it back to what was happening, because what I didn't speak too much about is like where things were 2 years ago, or give like a little refresher of that. And from what I remember from that time, it was still a world that was very focused on, from the carbon markets perspective, avoidance credits and and forest carbon, and a lot of questions around counterfactuals. The biggest, things that people would talk about would say like, oh my God, how can you have these carbon credits where the whole thing is based upon, oh, you wouldn't have cut down the trees? And people still talk about that. But I think the industry has, in many ways, this subset of the industry that's focused on durable removals has kind of moved away and moved past that, which I think is a positive development. There is, and I'm not as up to date on these numbers, but there are ways that, like looking at what percentage of the total removal, what percentage of the total carbon market activity is this removal sliver, is something that I should have a better handle on. And I think there are some places you can Google or look online to find out. But putting that into context is, I think, an important part of it.
Yeah,
Other
and
stuff that's changed. Yeah.
that'd be easier if we had better standards, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And reporting. If you're looking for overviews of where much of this is at least on the durable removals piece, CDR.FYI is a really good resource. A number of the slides around pricing and investment that I had were pulled from their work and annual reports that they've done. But they track and basically have a system where a lot of the registries or market players, because they want to show up on CDR FYI, are self-reporting their purchases to this website. And so it kind of serves as an industry tracker in a way of a lot of the activity.
Another question I had, which was, I guess this is more speculative or like big picture. Is there any aspect of this carbon problem that is uniquely local? Because it seems like a very much a global problem, and that
It is.
everybody's contributing to it. There's no way to have local solutions to changes in like carbon levels in the atmosphere. Like it's all, we're in this problem together, and everybody's contributing
Yep.
to the same bank.
Yeah, that is I mean, there are definitely, like, there are things that one can do locally, but the impacts are, it's the drop in the global bucket, right? It's never that any work that you would do when it comes to carbon, that any work that you would do regionally, that the benefits would be realized regionally on limiting warming, for instance. Where that is different, potentially, and I'm not a cooling person or a, like solar geoengineering, cloud brightening person, but I think that work is maybe can be more regional. That if you're looking at those kinds of cooling mechanisms, especially like reflective stuff, you're going to do that in a region. You're not cloud brightening in a way where then that dissipates globally. You're cloud brightening in a way where in your, eco region, the hope is that there's less radiation, or less, sun heat coming in, essentially.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it does seem like carbon removal is like a better way to go in terms of like actually
Yes.
getting at the root of what's happening. And
Mhm.
like, I guess the problem with some of the stuff that you mentioned was that if you pursue those strategies, you may very well be making the problem worse for other people. If not, like at a minimum, you're not improving the situation for other people.
Mhm.
And in fact, you might
Mhm.
be making it worse in some
Mhm.
ways. Um, did, uh, oh yeah.
Oh, we have
Uh,
another question.
oh yeah. Here, I'll bring this one up on screen.
Cool.
Could you
Regen
please
network.
update us on Region Network's perspective over the new developments on durable CDR and how
Yeah.
these could connect with Regen Network's approach.
So Regen Network I mean, it baked into the name is Regen, and the background of the founders, Christian Shearer and Gregory Landway, is that they were running a permaculture consultancy for a while, and a lot of the work that we were doing with Regen, it was really focused on ecological regeneration, and so where that intersects and where to date that has intersected with any of this durable CDR stuff, the only pathway that Regen has any active work with is biochar, basically. The I don't think that Regen was ever interested in getting into DAC or will necessarily, or stuff like Bex, like what Charm Industrial does, if you're familiar with them. But open system pathways and things like the enhanced rock weathering work that I was talking about is something that folks had considered at Regen, but I think what we were always lacking was, the way that Regen had developed in the last several years was really moving in a direction of working with partners who wanted to bring their protocol onto a platform that Regen had the market infrastructure and the data kind of infrastructure to support, and we just found better traction within the biodiversity space, and there were a lot of partners thinking more about biodiversity conservation and new developments around crediting for biodiversity and creating actual market mechanisms for biodiversity that both, there's like a UN, just like there's the COP conference for carbon, there's also now a COP conference for biodiversity, and there's a lot of people getting together thinking about biodiversity conservation at an international level and the market mechanisms to do that, and how do we unitize it, how do we measure it, how do we create like regulatory frameworks for people to invest in it. And so Regen really, in the last couple of years, I would say that like it's not that Regen responded to the focus on durable CDR, but Regen responded to the crisis of the previous voluntary carbon market in a different way than what a lot of the other carbon folks did, which was to go to durable CDR. And as that contained a lot of stuff that didn't feel very like regenerative in nature, and really like ecosystem first and ecological health first as the thing that you're tracking and living and breathing, we basically shifted towards working more with in the biodiversity space, and had a number of partners. Terrasos was, I think, the biggest partner that we had, which was a habitat bank developer from Colombia that had been operating for years. And, we did a big partnership with them to bring a bunch of their credits onto our infrastructure. And for folks who, just for context, Regen was the organization that I was working with, as I think I mentioned in the first slide, I was there 2021 through October of last year. So the overwhelming majority of my time in climate has been with them. And I'm still involved on some of the data protocol work that they're doing, because there's a few ways in which they're looking to standardize the actual way that data gets stored and serialized on the blockchain network amongst different parties. And yeah, that's stuff that I'm still quite engaged in.
We've got one more on Substack, which I can't bring up on screen yet since they're still in beta on their live stream stuff. How would you describe the time delays between development on the protocol side of things and the project development implementations affected by the protocols?
Well, I feel like in the carbon removal sector, a lot of the protocols are being developed alongside the project development. So typically what happens is you'll have a startup, you'll have an idea coming out of a university, you'll have a professor maybe co-found a startup with someone who's at the business school or someone externally who says, great, we've got this new approach, we think we can do a thing, let's make a business out of it. They have an idea of how they're going to do it. The first thing that they're doing is trying to focus on that business plan and that case, and figuring out where they fit maybe into the market and stuff. And the next thing that they're doing, as they're starting to think about how they're going to sell and get any funding for these credits, is whether they're going to engage with a registry, for the protocol development. And the question is like, if it's a new technology, which a lot of times it is, what that means is if you look at isometric, they don't have a specific protocol for your new, very bespoke, like, oh, it's not actually ocean alkalinity enhancement because we're doing it in a closed environment, and we're sucking water into like our little container, and then we're running this electrolysis process and then spitting it back out. And there are these other things so actually what then they'll do is they'll develop a relationship with these registries, and Isometric will basically put a few of their staff scientists on the project, and they'll co-develop a protocol or a methodology with them. And then now Isometric has a new protocol. So if someone else comes and does something quite similar, they could leverage that. And also Isometric has done a really good job in modularizing their scientific protocols. So there's different components that can be reused. There'll be one for storage, one for your feedstock, like what's the material that you're sourcing in, one for life cycle assessment, how you account for your own existing emissions. And each of those components can be reused so that if you're doing something new, maybe there's only one sliver that actually needs to be a completely new protocol from scratch. I hope that answers the question.
I think it did. We'll find out in the chat, but we're at the hour. So thank you, Cory, for coming on and sharing all your wisdom about climate protocols. And I think people will find applications for this elsewhere in the very large field of protocol studies. Where can people find you on social media?
Social media, Twitter at KOHWI. I'd say I'm like a little bit more I'm not active writing a lot on Blue Sky, but I'm more active reading on Blue Sky, which is Corloc, CORLOC. Also, I've got my GitHub and LinkedIn here on the slides. Feel free to reach out and connect, or email is really a great way to connect if folks would like to chat.
Okay, sweet. I will see you soon, and thanks for joining.
Thanks.
So yeah, there's Cory's information there, and I will take it down now. Thank you everybody for joining the Protocol Town Hall and our debut appearance on Substack Live. We will see you all soon. If you want to find out more about Summer of Protocols, go to summerofprotocols.com. We have our protocol symposium applications open until August 22nd. You can apply to the school or the Foundations workshop, both of which are happening from September 12th to 19th, and we hope you apply. So see you all soon. Next week, we have a guest talk talking about the Protocol Symposium and why you should join, and what to do, maybe even some tips. Okay, thanks everybody.